preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
During the course of this year, I have proceeded almost on the assumption as if there were two divergent tendencies in contemporary Jewish life which never came together. One might get the impression, watching what we have been doing since early in the fall, that only two major answers have emerged to the status of the Jew in contemporary society, one of them being a nationalistic answer, the answer given by the Jew of the State of Israel and by the Zionist movement, which defines being a Jew as one who either lives in the State of Israel or one who is helping the state come to be and will ultimately take up his residence there, who for some reason or another is delayed in making his way to the state. And the other answer is given largely in religious terms. That is to say, a person takes up his Jewish identity by virtue of being a member of the Jewish religion. He is a citizen of the regular democracy, or even not of the democracy of which he is a part, but since the modern state allows religion to be a private matter, since in one way or another church and state are somewhat separated in almost all modern countries, it becomes possible to say, yes, I am a full and equal citizen of the country, but religiously I am a Jew. We have also had occasion to point out that each of these two major living answers to the problem of what it means to be a Jew have, at least in their origins, been antagonistic one toward the other. The efforts to define Judaism as a religious basis, which began with the liberalizing of the Jewish religion, with an effort to change its forms and its way of expressing itself. The Reform movement was an anti-nationalistic movement. It was an anti-Zionist movement. In the beginning, it took a rather strong position that what makes us Jews is our religion. And therefore, any attempt to say that we are a national body or have certain national ties with one another will only get in the way of our becoming citizens of the states we are trying to become citizens of, will cast some doubt upon our ability to participate in and take advantage of the countries of which we are a part. Hence, they were from the beginning against nationalism. And, as I think I have pointed out along the way, the early Zionists were by and large overwhelmingly anti-religious. They were against the interpretation of Judaism as a religion, or certainly against Judaism, the interpretation of the Jewish people as primarily a religious entity. As a matter of fact, religion seemed to stand in the way to them, and both for scientific and political and socialistic reasons, religion and nationalism were antagonistic one toward the other. Now, if I left you at that point, you might not understand that various attempts have been made from time to time to merge these points of view. They haven't been true of the two thinkers of whom we have spoken so far. Both Leo Baeck and Franz Rosenzweig have to be classified as not so much anti-Zionists, but as rather, what shall I say, positive non-Zionists. They were clearly Jews, they loved Judaism, they loved Hebrew, they knew Hebrew, they read Hebrew, they understood Hebrew. They would even help out with certain kinds of cultural programs or certain kinds of humanitarian programs with regard to various Zionist endeavors. But they couldn't by any stretch of the imagination be called Zionists. Their interpretation was strictly an interpretation of Judaism and the Jewish people very largely in religious terms, even though in very authentic Jewish religious terms. Now, most of the rest of the people about whom we are going to speak for the rest of the year have in one way or another tried to make a synthesis of these two major themes with which we have been dealing heretofore. I wouldn't overstress that. But at least it's interesting to watch how these two major points of view have tended now to converge. It is almost as if one admits that nationalism alone is not sufficient to explain Jewish identity. And on the other hand, as if religion alone is not sufficient to explain Jewish identity. Now, that's going to be rather an oversimplification, as you shall see, but I think it will hold us. Now, tonight I'd like to turn to what has happened within the Zionist movement, and the efforts within the Zionist movement to effect some kind of a synthesis on this point. You will recall that one of the major problems within the Zionist definition of what it means to be a Jew has been whether or not Jewish nationality has any unique characteristics, or whether it's simply land and language. If there are Jews living on the traditional Jewish soil, speaking the Hebrew language, could they all be, say, Roman Catholics or Buddhists or Hindus by religion, and yet still feel that they were authentically Jewish? Now that's the extreme of the one, and you will recall the various interpretations, particularly Ahad Ha'am's effort to derive some kind of an ethical personality and character to the Jewish people. Now, in this question of seeking to find out what is characteristic of Jewish nationality, the effort has been made by Zionists, not by anti-Zionists, not by people who are not religious, but by religious Jews to create a fusion of both these points of view. Why shouldn't a man who has a Zionist point of view at the same time be a religious man? Or to put it the other way around, why shouldn't a religious man at the same time be a Zionist? So that the first effort to bring these two themes together, which we shall deal with in this series of lectures, is the one which takes place within the Zionist movement. Now let's take that up for a moment. After all, isn't there a traditional basis for upholding both points of view at the same time? Isn't the more authentic Jewish tradition, as perhaps we can understand it a little easier today, now that the heat of controversy at the end of the 19th century has died down, a mixture of both certain religious as well as certain kinds of national both theories and understandings? Let's take a look at the Jewish tradition for a moment. Does the Jewish tradition, for example, even in its most religious phase, does this tradition have any spot for the land of Israel in it? Does the particular soil have any spot to play in the most traditionally observant Jewish way of understanding the Jewish religion? And the answer is quite clear. Of course it does. It has a rather important role to play. One of the fundamental principles of Jewish law is the principle which divides people in terms of their category, in terms of the responsibility under which they stand, by geography. Once a Jew is 13, it makes no difference practically who or what he is. Everyone stands under the Jewish law. There is no distinction of Jews as to age. Whether a Jew be white, brown skin, black skin, no matter what his racial basis is, there is no special category for him under Jewish law. But there is a different category in Jewish law for one who lives in the land of Israel and one who lives outside. The law provides for a certain special responsibility for the man who lives within the land as distinct from the man who is outside. Now that doesn't say that the man outside is any worse off, because he too can fulfill the Torah. But the difference between the man who is outside the land of Israel, the man who is inside the land of Israel, is that the man who lives inside the land of Israel can fulfill more of the Torah. There are whole areas of Jewish law which you don't have to carry out once you leave the land of Israel. And while you may consider yourself to be a good Jew while you are outside the land of Israel, in fulfilling what you do have to fulfill, nonetheless, if you really wanted to fulfill the entire basic, fundamental, divine, given Jewish law, you ought to be in the land of Israel. Let me give you a very simple example. Almost all the laws relating to agriculture are laws which a Jewish farmer outside the land of Israel does not need to fulfill. Let us take, for example, the law regarding the sabbatical year. Every 7th year, the Jewish farmer is instructed to leave his land lie fallow. He may not carry out the usual agricultural operations of tilling the land and planting and reaping and harvesting and rest. He doesn't do that. The land rests. Now, supposing he is a Jewish farmer in Indiana or northern Italy or Argentina. He says he's a good Jew. He wants to be a good Jew. Does he every 7th year then not fulfill this law? I mean, is it his obligation to let his farm rest that 7th year? And the answer is quite clear. No. That law applies only when you're inside the land of Israel. And there are a whole series of others of such laws. Now, you would think, therefore, that the logical consequence of this would be that every believing traditional Jew would in a way be a Zionist. That is to say, if, to use the traditional figure, there are 613 commandments, if of those 613 commandments, a sizable number cannot be fulfilled outside the land, therefore almost every Jew should want sooner or later to try to get back to the land so that he could fulfill all 613. And as a matter of fact, to a considerable extent, this is true. The Jewish tradition had in it all the way from the very days when the Jews began to leave the land of Israel. Prayers for the return to the land, the dream of the return to the land, the hope for the return to the land. And one has this long and unusual history of the Jews in the land of Palestine, which is a history which seems to end but never ends. You can always find a few Jews in Palestine sooner or later. And as a matter of fact, in our own time, there is a family which claims in one of the villages of the state of Israel that it and its ancestors have been continually resident on the soil ever since the Second Temple was established. There's a prominent Jewish historian who has once said, "Never think you have discovered the first Jew to get anywhere. As soon as you think you've discovered the first Jew, you'll discover another one who was there before. And these are the ones. They're still left over." Now, there has been this history of attachment, of desire, of love of the land, of the interest to go back. And Jews always have been going back. From time to time, there have been movements of Jews back to Palestine. We know, for example, of the individual pilgrimages of the Sephardic Jews, such as Yehuda Halevi, who not only wrote poetry but went back to the land. We know of the effort of Judah Nasi, the Duke of Naxos, in the 16th century to start Jewish settlement in the land. And all through Jewish history one can point to this kind of thing. So there is a kind of inherent nationalistic, so to speak, or Zionistic emphasis within traditional Jewish religion. Then you may ask, why did it not happen that the Zionist movement did not spring from the religious lines, but sprang instead from the secular groups? Why was it that the early Zionists were so anti-religious, and the religious leaders themselves were not the major leaders of the contemporary political movement we know as Zionism? The answer, I think, has to be explained in the way in which the traditional Jew looked upon the action involved in fulfilling the return to the land. After all, what does the modern nationalistic movement seek to do? It says, we are the people. We are the government. We make the corporate decisions. We take the action. It is for us to act. We take upon ourselves the responsibility of setting up a government or a state. We go to colonize and the rest. And its emphasis is upon man and man's action. But that's not quite what the tradition said about the return to the soil. Because to the return to the ancestral soil in the traditional Jewish religion was linked up with another idea, namely the idea of the Messiah, of the coming of that messianic age in which God would help Israel fulfill itself and fulfill, as a matter of fact, all of human history, in which God would bring the Jew back. So that when the Jew prayed in the daily service for a return to the land of Israel, he didn't pray for courage so that he himself might go. He didn't pray for strength that he might break the bonds of residence where he was and take off for the Holy Land. Oh no. He prayed for God to bring him back. God was to be the motive agent. God was to be the force that saw to it that this historical drama was fulfilled. So that as a result, far from being Zionistic in attitude, the early religious leaders who came into contact with the Zionist movement looked upon it almost as a form of blasphemy. It was a kind of derogation of God's power. It was an insult to the messianic dream of Israel, for men to do this by themselves, when God had promised that he would do this in his own good time. One could very easily point to the whole history in the Jewish tradition of those who had tried to bring the Messiah, who had tried, as the Hebrew puts it so nicely, to force the end, to pressure the historical conclusion. And therefore the leaders of the Jewish traditional religion were against the entire attitude of a Zionist movement which took it upon itself to do what God was supposed to do. This was arrogance. This was prideful. This was sinful. This was not the fulfillment of what the tradition had desired. And the attitude then which these early leaders took was an attitude not just on the theological basis of whether the Messiah was coming or not, or who was the Messiah. They certainly didn't think Herzl was the Messiah, that's for sure. But it was an attitude based upon their whole notion toward change. You must remember that the Zionist movement was a modern movement. It stood for modernity, for coming into the future, for finding a new role, for a new place for the Jewish people. The old place wasn't good enough. The situations in which Jews had found themselves isolated and cut off in a peculiar status, persecuted and oppressed. This was exactly the status that the Zionists were trying to remedy. They were trying to leave the past. Zionism, in its modern sense, is a question caused by the new social circumstance in which Jews found themselves. And therefore, Zionism is an effort to move forward and to make progress in terms of meeting the new conditions under which Jews found themselves. But what was the condition in which traditional Judaism found itself, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe? It wasn't, may I say, most unfortunately, it was not a movement which was alive and flexible in terms of moving with the times. This is my judgment. I make it, in all honesty, as my own. Traditional Judaism had at one point, almost unquestionably, not at one point, almost in its entire history before the 15th, maybe the 16th century, had been flexible, had somehow unconsciously managed to grow and adapt within the traditional framework. But the traditional leaders of the 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe were not in that position. Economically, the status of the Jew had degenerated. Politically, it was completely confused. Socially, the communities were large and certain kinds of education flourished, but the vitality of having a future of growth was not there. This was a static period. If not static, it was a period of contraction, of slow stultification. Therefore, they weren't ready to move forward. They were reactionary. They wanted to preserve the past. And by wanting to preserve the past, they were against anything that sought to take the Jew forward. Because forward somehow meant away from Judaism, which had now been the Jewish religion, which had now become connected with the older forms and ways of observance. So this then became a communal fight, a social issue, a matter of debate and argument among the Jewish community. The leaders of Zionism had to fight the leaders of religion. The leaders of religion were fighting the Zionist movement as a false interpretation of Jewishness and as a movement away from the traditional values of Judaism. Now, I needn't go into why the Zionist leaders were anti-religious. They were anti-religious because of the fact that the rabbis were acting this way, and because of all their problems of being socialists and scientifically oriented in the modern sense, and having the difficulties of religion which all modern men have faced. They would have needed something like a liberal Jewish religion, something which enabled them to bring their science and their Jewishness together in a way that most traditional Jews seem, at least to most non-traditional Jews, to have been unable to do heretofore. Now, having stated this opposition as strongly as I can and explained to you why, though the Jewish religion contained within it certain seeds of Zionism, the situation worked out so that the religious Jews tended to be anti-Zionist, and the Zionists tended to be anti-religious. Let me explain to you that from the very beginning, there were a few intrepid souls who did not take this point of view. There were rabbis of some distinction, men like Alkilai and Mohilever, and certain others, who even before the Zionist movement began and after the Zionist movement began, stood up in their full rabbinical authority and aligned themselves with the movement. Mohilever sent a rather long and significant statement to the First Zionist Congress, aligning himself with this movement. But these were exceptions, they were individuals. Yet their influence had a certain kind of effect. None of them was a great ideologist, and since it's the ideology which interests me most, I'm not going to spend time on the early forerunners. As a matter of fact, there hasn't been any real ideologist of this position, because as one looks at it, there seems to have emerged from within the traditional Jewish group, there seems to have emerged simply a need and a feeling for a traditionally Jewish religious Zionist interpretation. I think it was Mohilever who was in charge at the beginning of the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center, the office charged with the affairs of the spirit with regard to Zionist work. And around this activity, there eventually grew up what came to be known through his disciples, the party known as the Mizrahi. The Mizrahi, whose name probably doesn't just mean eastward, but or the Easterner, but probably is from the abbreviations of the Merkaz Ruchani, the spiritual center. At any rate, regardless of where the name comes from, a whole party comes into being. And the party is now based upon a single premise. The division between nationalism and religion is false and ruinous. It is false both to nationalism and it is false both to religion, and it must be stopped. We maintain both positions with full wholeheartedness, and as a matter of fact, we claim that we are the only ones, therefore, who have the honest answers to both questions. For example, nationalism. What does your nationalism mean, really, unless it has some kind of character? Some specific way which points it out as Jewish. And how can you say that there is anything more meaningfully Jewish than the Jewish religious tradition? And we're not talking about something ethical and spiritual and abstract. We're talking about Torah and mitzvahs. We are talking about the traditional law. This is what gave character to our people. For 2,000 years, what held the Jewish people together was not the land and not the language. What actually held them together day by day was the traditional Jewish law. Therefore, if you add land and language, you shouldn't leave out what that other major structural item was, namely Jewish religion, and Jewish religion as traditional law. Therefore, we are going to be fully traditional and observant Jews. We are Orthodox. But it is through orthodoxy that nationalism is fulfilled. It's a very cogent argument, isn't it? It's a very difficult one to refute. It says if your nationalism is going to mean something, it ought to mean something in terms of a content. And what could be a more authentic and meaningful Jewish content than this? But the argument went the other way around as well. To the Jews who argued that religion was sufficient, they said, how can you say a thing like that? In the first place, you can't even do all the commandments. If you want to do the commandments, the least you can do is to go to the land and try to live there. And there's abundant material in the Jewish tradition which says that a man ought to make every effort possible to go to the land of Israel to live there and settle there. And if you are fulfilling more of the commandments, if you are building a Jewish society in which other people are Jews, in which the structure of the community life now is going to be a Jewish structure, it will be possible for you for the first time to live out your religion. Take what happens to a traditionally Jewish community, even in such a city as New York, where 1 out of every 3 persons is a Jew, approximately. Even in a city like New York, it's not easy to live a traditional Jewish life to the full extent of the law. It's even difficult to find places to eat properly. They're there, but it's quite an effort. One has to make a sincere and serious effort if one isn't willing to cut corners. Or take a simple question like attendance at school, if you want your children to go to school. Now, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur may be an excused absence. But up until now, at least, the school has been open by George. And they had to be excused from it, even though no one was there. And what about the first and the last days of Sukkot? What about the last day of Sukkot? Well, is it a holiday or isn't it a holiday? It's a divinely ordained holiday. The Bible itself speaks about the 8th day of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres. And therefore, if you're going to observe Shmini Atzeres, well, even in New York, observing Shmini Atzeres is very difficult. Very difficult. Therefore, if you had a community in which everyone was Jewish, you wouldn't have these problems of whether you could observe Shmini Atzeres. Everybody be observing Shmini Atzeres. It's our holiday. To fulfill the Jewish religion, therefore, the land is required. Or take the problem of Jewish education. How is it possible to believe that there can ever be a meaningful or an intelligent Judaism or Jewishness without a knowledge of Judaism? And a knowledge of Judaism means eventually, from the traditional point of view, a knowledge of the Jewish language and a knowledge of the classical texts in the original languages. Well, how do you hope to be able to carry that kind of thing out in a democratic society in which your children go to the public school system? All right, you say, we will build a parochial school system. Or since that's a dirty word, you will build an all-day school system in which your child will go to separate Jewish schools. Well, if you're going to separate your child from the general community in his education, why don't you bring him in a place where whether he's outside of school or inside of school, he will be Jewishly educated. Here you have to fight the culture. No matter how orthodox you are, December comes. And when December comes, every Jewish child is subjected to standards and influences outside. Why don't you bring him to a country where he will grow up learning Hebrew, where the language will not be a special problem, because everyone knows the language, where the Bible will be part and parcel of his heritage, where as part of his knowledge of the heritage of the nation of which he is a part, he will know something of the great books and traditions of his people. Well, that's a terribly persuasive argument. It's a magnificently persuasive argument. It is, it seems to me, as logical and as worthwhile and as meaningful an argument as anything that we have come across, assuming that one is a believing traditional Jew. And yet it cannot be said that the Mizrahi movement, the movement for fully integrating traditional Judaism and Zionism, has met with any overwhelming effect. It has not been because that this unison has not been expressed in the body of great men. It's a little difficult to put your fingers on a man who would quite express the unity of both these points of view in his own life, as we have been able to do with so many other movements in Jewish history. But there is one man who stands rather preeminent among the great rabbinic figures who have been connected with the traditional Jewish Zionism. And this is the first chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi, not of the Sephardi community, because each had its own chief rabbi. The first chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community, the famous Rav Abraham Kook. Rabbi Kook in this country, yet somehow always known as Rav Kook. The Rav, almost in our day, the rabbi of Palestine. Now, Rav Kook is an extraordinary figure. If any man should have been able to convince his compatriots and the people of his time about the living reality of these two themes at one time, integrated, it should have been Rav Kook. Why? Because in the first place, he was an extraordinary figure in the diaspora. He was one of those students who grew up in Eastern Europe, and at a very early age, at the age of 18, I believe, was given his rabbinical ordination, and he went from one larger community to another larger community, and he had a tremendous reputation. And he left them, and he went to Palestine to live. He went to Palestine to live because he was a Zionist. Already as a youth, he was a Zionist. He was a person who knew somehow that the land of Israel had a part to play in his life. And he went there, and he lived there. He was chief rabbi of the Ashkenazi community of Jaffa. And this is where he made his life. Then during World War I, he was trapped out of the country, and eventually got back to the country. And when the mandate was established and the Jewish community came into its own, he was named the chief Ashkenazi rabbi. In effect, he became the chief rabbi. And he was known through the breadth of the land. His fame reached across the United States. Now, in such a man, it is difficult to know whether his personality or his writings had more influence. It can't be his writings, because while he did some writing while he is alive, and they're quite extraordinary, it isn't his writings which are quoted. On the other hand, if you want to talk about a man, and you want to capture his spirit, how do you capture his spirit when he's gone? You have to turn to his writings, the one tangible record of his spirit. Only in this case, the spirit of the man seems to be more important than anything he wrote. Now, what was the characteristic of him which can be glimpsed but not fully grasped in his writings? The man was a genuine, honest-to-goodness mystic. He was one of those gifted human beings who somehow spontaneously and immediately knew and felt the deepest religious truths as if they were immediately given. He wasn't tortured with questions about why is there a such and such, or how could it happen that there was a such and such, or the like. These were not his questions. He didn't have any of the questions of modern man. To the contrary, he had the opposite. He had that kind of wonderful naivete and simplicity which comes that when you ask him a question, it's almost as if he looks at you as if to say, is that a question? Is it possible to ask such a thing? Because to him the answer is so obvious, the reality of it is so immediately given, that he naturally tends to express it. He just simply states it forth. And there's something wonderfully appealing about this point of view. It's wonderfully appealing because when you are filled with questions and confusion and ambivalence and conflict of every kind, and you come in touch with somebody who really believes something, genuinely stands for something, has a real conviction that reality has been given to him, it makes you wonder who is right. Most of the time when you're confused, you think that your question is real. The only reality that you know is that you doubt and you worry and you wonder and you are disturbed, and that's the most real thing to you, your doubt. You're generally also happy that other people have doubts and questions, because then you know that your questions really are the reality of our time. Many a person seeking to define religion in our time has simply said that religion is asking certain kinds of questions. Ours is not a time in which religion is a time of answers, a thing which gives answers. It is something which provides more searching and more sensitive questions. There's a good deal of truth to that. But supposing you, the questioner, suddenly come across someone to whom the question is not real, to whom all your questions are a kind of myopia, short-sightedness, lack of vision in you. You begin to wonder for a moment whether the questions upon which you base your reality are real or whether he is real. Now, the great flaw in such personalities is that when they know what's real, they very often tend to jam it down your throat. I mean, they have the truth, and you don't have the truth, and therefore they force you to follow their truth. They know what God wants because it's given to them. They experience it without very much question at all. Therefore, the normal tendency of such a person possessing this knowledge is to use it as a club over other people. And if he has any desire to exalt himself, then he uses his religious experience as a means of pride and position and status and dignity. You know people whose whole religious point of view is to point out that somebody else isn't as religious as they are. No matter how kosher somebody is in the family, they're always more kosher. No matter how careful somebody is with the Shabbos law, they're always more careful. And their whole goal in life is to point out to somebody else why they're not really as religious as they ought to be. But they, in turn, are religious. There's always one in every family. If you don't have one in your mishpacha, maybe I can dig an extra one up and I'll be glad to lend Licia. Now, it was not just that Rav Kook was a mystic that was so extraordinary. It was the attitude which he brought to it. Now, he had the traditional mystic point of view that there really is a God and that this is the God of the tradition and that God is given. But he had one other mystic certainty which he knew, which changed his attitude in this whole question, and particularly towards Zionism. And that was the mystic knowledge that God is always present in the Jewish people. The Jewish people and God cannot be separated. Sometimes there is a hiddenness, sometimes it seems as if the bond has been broken, sometimes it seems as if God isn't there. But that mustn't fool you. God dwells in the midst of this people. They may turn away from him, they may reject him, they may ignore him, they may pay no attention to him. God is in the midst of his people, and he knew it. He knew it so convincingly that nothing the people did could change his mind about it. And as a result, he was a tremendous liberal. Anybody else would get upset at what the Jews were doing. He couldn't get upset. So they want to make believe they're turning against God? All right, let them turn against God. Foolish. But sooner or later they'll come back to God. Because what is the Jewish people without God? Nothing. Nothing. They can't turn away from God. Let them, all right. They want to pay more attention now to building up the state and learning how to be farmers and learning how to be garbage men than to studying Talmud. All right. They are only preparing the way. In one of the favorite little parables which have come down from him, unfortunately there aren't very many. The whole problem of the anti-religious attitude of the people who were building the state, since most of them weren't religious, the whole anti-religious attitude used to be an argument for other Orthodox Jews to say, how can you be a Zionist? How can you take part in this when these people, they don't observe the Shabbos, they do one Chilul Hashem after another, they eat on Yom Kippur on purpose, they hold dances, Kol Nidra night, anything just to prove that they're free from what you're doing. And his attitude was a very simple one. He would say, look, while they were building the temple in Jerusalem, any ordinary carpenter could take his hammer and go into the Holy of Holies. As long as the building was being prepared, the simplest workman had access to what was later to become the holiest place. When the building is built, then you have a right to say only the holy have a right to go in. In the meantime, everyone is preparing the temple. That's what we're doing. It's not that the Messiah has arrived. It's not that the age of peace and justice and love and brotherhood is here. It is that everyone in his own way, particularly whether he recognizes it or not, is paving a way for God. Because here in this land, this is the land in which God and the Jewish people somehow become one together again. They can never be one as they are one here. But to do that, the nation must be built up. The people must be restored. You've got to have healthy bodies, physically well-adjusted people, in order for them to be truly religious. Now that's a liberality of spirit, that's a breadth of understanding, that's a humanity which one normally doesn't attach to certain kinds of traditional mystics. Particularly of mystics who are mystics of law, who say that the Jewish law or any other kind of law is the basis upon which religion must be built. And yet, even Rob Cook was unable to convince people that both by life and example and teaching, he has written a number of small books. They're somewhat difficult to read, and because they are based upon his mystical experience, it's a little difficult to understand why he says the things he says, and sometimes a little difficult to understand exactly what it is that he's saying. But the personality which had its effect upon the land, and which is available in part through the small group of writings that he left, did not have the effect of either converting the mass of Jews of the state of Israel to Zionists, nor the overwhelming majority of traditional Jews outside the land of Israel, the Jews in the land of Israel to Orthodox Jews, and the Jews in the land of, well, there I'm going again, the Jews. At any rate, the people in the diaspora should have become Zionists, the Orthodox Jews outside, and the Zionists inside the land of Israel should have become Orthodox Jews. They didn't. The fusion was not complete. It wasn't complete despite the fact that one of the other major antitheses of which I have spoken also was joined within the Mizrahi movement. And that was the antithesis between socialism and Orthodox religion. You will recall some time ago we spoke about how socialism in its cosmopolitan universal phase had been opposed to any kind of nationalism. Well, the Jews made that marriage. And the next thing you knew, you had Zionist nationalists. In those days, a considerable contradiction in terms. But socialism as such was always opposed to religion as a means of oppressing the working classes and a means of seeing to it that that those who had, the capitalists, would get the workers to work for them for less. But, again, one can begin to ask, what is the motive for socialism? Just as the motives for Zionism tend to spring out of the Jewish religion. So doesn't socialism, the idea that all men are brothers, they are economically brothers as well as spiritually brothers, that what each is able to do affects what every other brother is able to do. So that in a way, there's a powerful religious motive for being a socialist. If it's God who owns everything anyway, then there's no reason why we shouldn't share the ownership together. And nothing could be more socialist than that. Therefore, another movement sprang up within the Mizrahi movement. A movement which says we will be socialist, Zionist, traditional Jews. Hapoel HaMizrahi, the socialist Mizrahi movement. Now this sounds like the most valuable and ideal combination of all the factors we've spoken about. It's Zionist, it's socialist, and it's religiously observant. And as a matter of fact, in some ways, this is still one of the most intriguing movements on the Zionist scene in our day. For the reason that these people have not taken a passive point of view with regard to religion, have gone out and tried to build the kind of society which they think their religion should require of them, and at the same time have therefore had to confront many of the questions of Jewish law and Jewish religion, which others who were simply waiting, who were in a more passive Zionist position, who were simply building traditionally observant enclaves in the larger cities, problems that these people never had to face. But this, I think, was the major problem. The major problem is that all of this is founded upon an ability to be able to believe in traditional Jewish religion. And while I can understand how for many men orthodoxy is the major and, as a matter of fact, the only kind of religion possible for them, I believe it is fair to say that for perhaps the overwhelming majority of men in our century, or at least Jews in our century, or at least Jews who have been exposed to the kind of life in which the problem of Jewish identity would arise, life in some kind of a democratic, educated society, that for them, traditional Jewish belief is too difficult. Now, I will take up the question of Orthodox religion in our time, I believe 2 weeks from tonight, when we discuss the situation of Orthodoxy in modern times, and those of you who uphold this religious point of view will, I hope, take the opportunity then to discuss it. What I'm only trying to say this evening is that if I had to guess why it was that we do not have a real fusion of Orthodox religion and Zionist movement, the reason is that most Jews can't be Orthodox. And I would put it that way. Now, having said that, I shouldn't lead you to think that there have been no efforts to liberalize the Jewish religion. There are a couple of very interesting ones which have taken place within the land of Israel that need to be noted by us in dealing with this. One of them is a kind of a bypath, but the kind of bypath that we mustn't leave out. It is the story of a boy born in San Francisco who was educated as a Reform rabbi, who was a rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, New York, and who became a great Zionist rabbi. His name was Judah Leon Magnus, and he was an extraordinary figure. He was extraordinary because in some ways he was the closest thing to a prophet the 20th century has known. At any rate, he felt that he couldn't keep still when he believed in something. He was one of the few really ardent pacifists among the Jews who had been a pacifist before World War I, who was a pacifist all during World War I. He was even a pacifist during the Arab-Israeli War, although he did find the war against Hitler more than even his pacifism could bear. He was a man who, while born among German Jews and bred among German Jews, cast in his lot with what were then the Jews of the East Side. The downtown Jews of New York is against the uptown Jews. The rabbi of Temple Emmanuel, who nonetheless would get out on the street and march with the Jews in protest against something that had happened either in Europe or elsewhere in the world. He was a man who went to Palestine to live. It was Palestine in those days, and he became the rector and later the president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Now, he was a liberal. He was not an Orthodox religious Jew. He went to Palestine to live because he felt here the Jewish community, the Jewish religious community as he understood it, really had a chance to fulfill itself. Notice that he was connected with a university, an institution of learning and of spirit, because this is what he felt was appropriate for Jews. And notice that all during his life, he maintained this spiritual interest in Zionism. And yet one cannot say that there was any kind of following which arose for Judah Leon Magnus during the course of his life so as to bring these two points of view together. There may be a good and simple reason for that. One of them was that Magnus adopted what was politically a most unacceptable point of view. He was a believer not in a Jewish state, but in a binational state, a Jewish-Arab state. And he took the point of view that only in this way could amity and friendship, only in this way could a religiously justifiable political unity be established. Now, in our own time, there is another figure of whom we must take some note, because it is precisely with this question of the flexibility and the pliability of traditional Judaism that he has concerned himself, or at least that's why he has come most to our knowledge. Man is a very interesting man, a professor of chemistry. Somehow particularly appropriate that a Jew who should concern himself with Jewish law should not be a rabbi. It's about time, once again, that the rabbis did not have hegemony in Jewish life, although for those of you who would like to take it away from them, I suggest an adequate Jewish knowledge is an absolute prerequisite. At any rate, this gentleman, whose name is Isaiah Leibowitz, is a professor of chemistry, and he has, in a continuing series of very trenchant essays, opened up the entire problem of the flexibility of the Jewish religion in our time. Now remember, he is Orthodox. He is traditionally observant. If he wasn't, it would be impossible for him to get involved in this entire discussion. They'd immediately rule him out as a reform, as a non-Jew, as anything. But he doesn't speak from that position. He speaks from a position of absolute devotion to traditional Jewish law and its observance. And what does he say? He says, among other things, Jewish law does not require us to stand still. Jewish law has in it many opportunities and possibilities for forward development and movement. And we are not doing what we ought to do at the moment. That's the important point. He is not concerned so much with controversies that would disturb an American Jew. I mean, questions of hats on, hats off, kosher or non-kosher, these are questions which he wouldn't even raise. They wouldn't occur to him. But there are deeper questions. The question is Jewish law for the state of Israel, which is a Jewish community and a Jewish state, where Jews have responsibility for the government, is Jewish law, religious law, viable if it's only to be the kind of law which Jews used to have when they weren't the government, when they weren't responsible, when they weren't the community? Or doesn't Jewish law have to continue to grow and develop to meet the situations of our time? For example, take the simple question, says Leibowitz, of supplying communal services on the Sabbath. Should there be firemen working on Shabbos? Should there be people in the water pumping stations? Should there be someone supplying electricity? What about policemen on the Sabbath? Now, if your water and your electricity and your policemen and your firemen are all supplied to you by non-Jews, you don't have a question. Or if you are willing to say, no observant Jew will take such a job because it makes him work on the Sabbath, you are abandoning government services to the non-observant, non-religious Jew. If Jewish law is to meet the circumstances and requirements of our time in the state of Israel, then Jewish law must come face to face with the responsibilities of being the state of Israel. Can a traditionally observant Jew work to provide necessary and required community services on Shabbos? Or to put it the other way around, how can a state which wishes to live under the Torah, to be a religiously meaningful and authentic state, supply minimum services on the Sabbath without resorting to any of the legal fictions or the tomfoolery which occasionally have been indulged in by people to get around it? You know, the point that he makes is such a touching point. And I don't say that it leads to Reform Judaism or conservative Judaism or to any other kind of Judaism. But the question that Leibowitz raises is essentially the question which it seems to me which has held back the fusion of the Jewish religion and of Zionism. Namely, can the Jewish religion grow and develop to meet the needs and circumstances of our time? Perhaps if the thoughtful traditional Jew of the state of Israel, such as Professor Leibowitz and others, continue to question, the traditional rabbinate of the state of Israel will come to meet these problems. And once they come to meet these problems and discover the Jews can still be Jews, even under certain forms of changing law, they will then be able to show that the Jewish tradition is not essentially reactionary, which it very often seems to be. And demonstrating that, they will then give a kind of religious leadership, not only to the Jews of the state of Israel, but to the entire world. For after all, if Jewish law were changing and developing in the state of Israel, and that was what the Jewish tradition was, then maybe it might be possible once again to have only traditional Jews. We wouldn't have Orthodox, conservative, and Reform, perhaps, because if the Jewish tradition were moving along and certain kinds of flexibility were allowed, then everyone could be a Jew, depending upon the interpretations offered. It seems to me that the question from its Israeli end still is open. It's still a problem. It's still a question of what's going to happen to religion in the state of Israel. If Traditional Judaism continues to maintain itself as a separate, more or less ghettoized, more or less European form of religious observance. It seems to me it's going to have very little future in the state of Israel. It's going to be somewhat cut off and isolated, almost as it seems to be today. And the nice ladies who go to visit the state of Israel, who are always terribly distressed to discover that everyone doesn't go to synagogue and everyone doesn't believe in God, that these ladies will have much to fear. On the other hand, if the kind of natural unity between the Jewish religion and Jewish nationalism can be harnessed to some kind of forward motion, then there's a possibility that leadership may be given not only to the state of Israel, but to the entire world. Remember that while it's not likely to happen, if it were possible to convene a successor to the Sanhedrin, for which there are many legal obstacles, but if it were possible, that group would, in terms of traditional Jewish law, have the right to legislate within traditional Judaism for everybody. And it would have a right to deal with many of the most difficult and fundamental problems confronting us right now. Mind you, if they were only willing to decide that dishes which are made of china are not porous like wood, but are non-porous like glass, they could end the entire question of having two sets of dishes in all Jewish families. It would be as simple as that. But it's a long way before we have a Sanhedrin, and a long way until we see the real fusion within the state of Israel of Zionism and of the Jewish religion. And now we should stop for some questions. Yes? Combine those two in exactly the way the Jewish tradition did. Namely, you are allowed to change, but only within certain procedural rules and limits. You can't change past authority unless you convene a convocation, a court, an assembly, which is greater in numbers and weight of learning than the previous one. And the problem of convoking a Sanhedrin, which would be an official successor to the old legislative body, is a problem of finding someone who has a genuine rabbinical ordination. If we could all agree that one person had a genuine rabbinical ordination, then he could ordain anybody else. Then if he could, you could get 71 legitimate and authentic ordainees, and they could constitute a Sanhedrin. You could build up a Sanhedrin of great size which could legislate. But you can't do that now. You can't do that now because there is no agreement that anyone has a genuine ordination. We have ordination to serve as judges. It is agreed that we are all competent as judges, although, there are some conflicts as to which rabbi has a right to do what among the rabbis themselves. But we are by and large competent to judge, but not to legislate. We do not do legislation now. In the Orthodox Jewish tradition, we don't at all. Yes?
You know that the early course of Jewish history and when Sanhedrin passing in effect, were there many changes in the basic law?
Oh, sure. Now, it depends upon your point of view. If you are a traditional Jew at this point, you say, there were no changes in Jewish law. I mean, there were certain interpretations made, but that doesn't change Jewish law. If you are a liberal, you say, yes, they changed Jewish law. They took Jewish law and they practically annulled it. Let's take a simple example. The Torah says quite explicitly, some of you may be getting tired at that point, therefore I always bring in an example that has something to do with sex. Wake up, everyone. Wake up. Wake up. Wake up. The Torah says that a woman who is suspected of committing adultery is given bitter water to drink. You write on a scroll certain verses, and these verses are then dissolved in water. The ink is washed off into the water, and then you give it to her to drink. And if she committed adultery, her belly will swell, and then you know that she committed adultery. You don't have to wait 9 months either. And if you don't, if her belly does not swell, then it's clear that she didn't commit adultery. Now that's biblical. There's no way getting around that law. It says it right simply. Okay? But the ruling was made that because after the Romans had swept over the country of Palestine, and it was impossible really to say who had committed adultery and who had been raped, and who had by will and who had by force majeure been involved. And the rabbi simply said that due to the unsettled conditions of the time, we cannot carry out this rite. Just like that. And it was done away with. Now, from a reformer's point of view, you can't change the biblical law when you want to. But from the traditionalist point of view, you say, no, wait a minute, it was only done for the time and circumstance. It couldn't have really operated under those circumstances. Divine law, the law stands. They just didn't follow it during a given period. And one could give many more examples. Yes? Well, it's a very interesting question. They meet it by following the law and by developing new kinds of law. Let me give you 2 examples. One is an old one, and one is a semi-old one, but somewhat new. The older one is this. Supposing you own a cow, and the cow gives milk. Now, it may be a nice, good Jewish cow that doesn't know when Shabbos comes. Therefore, you have a problem. Comes Shabbos, that cow's udder is full of milk. And if you don't milk that cow, it's very painful to the cow, because the cow is used to producing the milk and being milked out of the milk, and therefore it's very painful. So the question comes up, what do you do? Milking a cow on Shabbos is trade. But causing pain to an animal is also trade. Not quite the same category. So as a result, the rule is that you milk the cow to avoid giving the animal pain. Very humane. What do you do with the milk? Spill it out on the ground? No, you don't spill it out on the ground because that's wasteful. Therefore, you may use it, but you can't gain profit out of desecrating the Sabbath. So therefore, what you do is you dye this milk with a vegetable dye to indicate that no profit is to be derived out of this. You make it green or blue or orange or something. You make cheese out of it, and it can be sold, but you don't get the proceeds of the funds because you did it for the animal's sake, not to make profit. Lovely? I think it's beautiful. It's a lot more ethical than most of us are. Come on, let's be honest. A. Now I'll give you another example. This past year, 5719, was according to the... No, wait a minute. Just a minute, let me think. I think it was this past year, maybe it's this year for all I know. I'm a little confused. Was the sabbatical year. One or the other was the sabbatical. No, I guess it's this year is the sabbatical year. I think this year is the sabbatical year. I was confused because of the esrogim, which I will get to in a moment. Now, the sabbatical year comes if you're an observant farmer. One of the laws you do get to follow is the law not to grow anything upon the earth. Now, the school's divided at this point. There are 2 theories, naturally. One school says, we are not allowed to grow anything upon earth if it's owned by a Jew. But if it's not Jewish earth, and you're only renting it, you are allowed to use it because it's not yours. Therefore, what they do is they get together all the traditional farmers, and they sell the land of Palestine for £1 to an Arab. And for 1 year, that Arab owns most of the farms, and therefore any Jew can go out and farm. Now say some of the other traditional Jews, this is, look, this is a legal fiction. You may be within the law, but, this isn't really the spirit of the law. What was the point of coming here? The point of coming here was so we could own the land, and it was our land, and to do it. And this really goes against Jewish law, in a way. Therefore, we are not going to grow anything upon the land. And they don't. But while theoretically, if you observe the Shemitah year, the Bible promises that the land will bring forth twice as much the year before, Nonetheless, under our present economic structure, when one makes 20-year loans, God forbid, 3 times the Shemitah can come up in 20 years, 3 times the land can lie fallow, and certain other problems occur. So what have they done? They wouldn't farm, God forbid. But some of them have gone into hydroponics, in which you grow fruits and vegetables on water. You take great big tanks of water, you cover them with chicken mesh, you put stuff on the top of them. I don't know, on some of the aircraft carriers, men used to grow vegetables this way. And the roots never get into the ground. The ground lies fallow. Now that's kosher. And believe me, it's perfectly kosher. The land lies fallow. You really observe the sabbatical year fully. And in the meantime, you're not deprived, because what the law said was the land should lie fallow. You're letting it lie fallow. So this is the way of developing it. Now, we've brought up the question of esrogim, because one of the very interesting questions came up is this. After all, if it comes Sukkot, and you're in Israel, and you want a lulav and an esrog, where should you better be able to get an esrog than in the state of Israel? This is where most of the citron trees grow. Little yellow, lemon-like fruit, which is held in one hand, while the lulav is held in the other hand, and these are shaken as the symbols of the Sukkot feast. Maybe some of you will have to give you a course in Jewish holidays and festivals so you can catch up on these small details. At any rate, see, if you were in the state of Israel, you'd know what this was, because everybody would be celebrating Sukkot. It just goes to prove the point I made a little while ago. But you want an esrog. But if you are a Jew enough to want an esrog, you want an esrog that came from a farmer who was keeping the sabbatical year. Therefore, in the markets in Israel, special stalls were set up, or some of the dealers would display signs which said, these esrogim are guaranteed to come from sabbatical year observing farms. Because obviously, if you bought an esrog from someone who was selling it, he was gaining profit from the fruit of the land for the year. On the other hand, you wanted to have one from a fellow who was observing the sabbatical year, he couldn't take money for it. So he had to give you the esrog. On the other hand, how could he get money for it? So a complicated thing was worked out whereby you gave money either to a third party or made a contribution or the like. But life goes on. These are some examples of the problems that you run into. Yes, sir?
As a matter of expediency and practical fact, living in a practical world, Jews are practical. Don't you think that the basic law in Israel will be modified in time?
You see, you ask me an opinion. Apparently, I gather from your question you have an opinion on this subject, which is not difficult to detect from the question. But I am not a good man to answer your question, because I have a point of view in this regard. I am not a traditionally observant Jew. But let me first answer from the point of view of the traditionally observant Jew, because the other point of view is obvious. What is the other point of view? The other point, of course, they've got to be modern. It's a modern state. They're going to develop and grow, and Judaism will grow with it, and you'll see. That's obvious. But suppose we take the other point of view, which we will discuss sometime later in the spring, if we ever get to the spring in this crazy winter of ours. At any rate, you take the opposite point of view and you say, you misunderstand. What you think is that the Jewish religion will develop by changing. To the contrary, it is modern man who will develop by changing so that he can be a Jew again. What is so important about modern man? Ulcers, heart attacks, cha-cha and mambo instead of Talmud. I mean, so what's so wonderful? No. By living in the state of Israel and not having to go about apologizing to the non-Jews, he'll stop chasing after all these fancy things that bother him half the time. By knowing that this is his country and his land, and that it's organized on a somewhat communal, cooperative, socialistic basis, he won't have to make so much money because the government will take it away from him in taxes anyway. Therefore, over a period of time, a healthy sense of values may emerge. Who are our presidents? Our first president is a chemist. Our second president is an anthropologist. This is the kind of man we want, the great men in our country. I mean, it's just marvelous. Ben Gurion's going to be here tomorrow night. What is he going to do? Tomorrow night he's giving a lecture. He's giving a lecture, as I understand it, on science and ethics, the contribution of the Jewish, Greek, and Hindu philosophers to the solution of this problem. Now, I'll get to Ben Gurion next week, but believe me, that's all I'm going to say. Just that, no politics, no politics. The president, if I know Eisenhower better, he should teach him philosophy. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall see you next week.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.